Let me tell you a Latin American story, and this takes place way back in 2009 in Honduras, when the democratically elected president is overthrown in a coup and the new administration starts making all the changes that new administrations after a coup normally start doing. They start privatizing public companies, they start making overtures to foreign corporations and creating these special economic zones for foreign companies to take advantage of, and crucially, they start cracking down on anybody who would oppose them. We're talking hundreds of activists and labor leaders and journalists and others. They are killed, they are tortured, or they just disappear. Now, the liberal administration of Barack Obama in the United States is horrified. Publicly, they call for an end to this madness and the restoration of democracy in Honduras, but keen observers are looking at this and saying, actually, behind the scenes, things are a little bit different. See, the United States actually never declared this as a coup, because declaring it as a coup would have meant having to apply sanctions that the United States wasn't really willing to afford at that point in time. Privately, they actually worked with the leaders of the coup to channel aid into military and police, the ones committing all these abuses in the beginning. When the coup government held very flawed elections, they also legitimized the coup by recognizing those sham elections. And all the while, the elites in Honduras and the corporations in the United States were the ones that benefited. But Justin, you might ask, we're supposed to be covering the first chapter in Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America today. Why are we talking about Honduras in 2009? Well, it's because Eduardo Galeano, in his masterwork, this book that we're reading right now, recognized one key thing, and that is that empires change, but not that much. And just like Spain did that back then, so now the United States does that, pretending to care about things like democracy, even as the extraction just continues. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. If you watched the introduction video and you're reading along with the series in order, then that is awesome. This is really, really cool. You're holding in your hands right now one of the most important books written about Latin American history ever. And if you haven't gotten a chance yet to watch that first introduction lecture, I actually recommend that you do go back and check that out beforehand. I try to get into a little bit of background about what Galeano was doing in his historical context, a little bit about his biography, and then a breakdown of some key issues that will be important to keep in mind as we tackle this book. Open Veins, there's been a lot of work that's been done about exploitation of the continent and the US and its role in imperialism, all of this stuff. There are really heartfelt and soaring works from some incredible writers, including Isabel Allende, who writes the foreword in this book. A lot of stuff is out there, but this book still holds kind of a special place for a lot of people, myself included. And one of the reasons that I think this book really stands out, and I said this a little bit in our intro lecture, is that it is written by a poet. I mean, this is a man who understood his craft. He understood his audience and he understood the value of words. So he writes so beautifully and evocatively in this book, and it's just a pleasure to read through it. And we'll get into some of the things that he says in this book that just perfectly capture what's going on the continent back then and today. Just a quick plug here. If you would like to read along with this book or with any other leftist books that I already have out there, including Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, all of that is on the Patreon channel. You can check that out, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. All of that material is there. It is all up for free. The main reading series is absolutely free and always will be. So any of those books, if they strike your interest, you can read along with those on your own time. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. YouTube channels out there, a bunch of social media channels, especially TikTok is really taking off right now, which is awesome. Love to see that. So it's just really cool. It helps me sort of get the word about this channel out there. So I really appreciate everybody who's taking part in that kind of project and liking and commenting and giving your thoughts on this. It is really, really cool. And just a word of warning, of course, for this chapter and indeed this entire book, we are going to be talking about some really, really heavy stuff today. We are talking about colonization. We are talking about the genocide against indigenous peoples across the Americas. This is some really intense and heavy material. So if this is really going to bother you, maybe watch this with just a degree of caution as you go through this. There's really no way around talking about these kind of horrifying things when we come to something like colonization, or especially this book, Open Veins of Latin America, but I hope to do so with at least a little bit of humanity and humility in approaching this subject. So, bear with me as we go through some really, really horrifying and disgusting things that empire did in Latin America and the rest of the world. Now, if you've started this chapter or you've already read this chapter, you will notice that there is a lot of material in here. So I will be breaking this down in 4 different categories. So sort of a roadmap for understanding what can often be, with Galeano, some wild stuff. He's writing this book in 12 weeks. He's synthesizing a bunch of stuff. He's pulling all of this stuff that he's got it at his fingertips together, and he's weaving it through. And so he's pulling from the Portuguese Empire and from Spain and from Britain. A lot of this stuff is coming together in this chapter, and it can be hard to really get a handle on it. So we're going to be doing a roadmap. We're going to be talking about 4 different things. We're going to be talking about conquest. We're going to be talking about how Latin America developed Europe. We're going to be talking about how Europe underdeveloped Latin America. And finally, at the end, we're going to be talking about how the colonizer justifies their actions. There's a lot of dense history in this book, so I'm hoping that this video will not be overly long as we talk about all this. It will just give you sort of a way to kind of structure your thoughts around this chapter, and then in your own time, you can go and luxuriate in the words of Galeano, because it is worth just kicking back and reading through this book. It is a beautifully, beautifully written book. And by the way, if you speak any Spanish and you can read some of the Spanish and understand it, Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina is a tremendous work to get into just from a language perspective. You will see how he puts a sentence together. It's beautiful and it's worth it. But let's get right into it, and let's start with conquest. Now, conquest, Galeano tells us a lot of the history of the early conquest of Latin America, which starts as Columbus sails in 1492 and continues through really the rest up until the present day, but especially in the so-called Age of Discovery. This is how it's often presented to us in textbooks, this Age of Discovery, which starts around the early 1500s and continues up until really the early 1700s, which is when you get these trends of industrialization that start to properly kick off. So this is a period of extraordinary, rapacious colonization throughout the rest of the world, and especially in Latin America. And Galeano tells us that conquest, especially for Spain, was about 2 things primarily. You have religion and you have gold. Now, religion is key here. Columbus, as I said, takes off in 1492, and this is how Galeano opens this chapter. He opens with this fabulous line. He says, when Christopher Columbus headed across the great emptiness west of Christendom, he had accepted the challenge of legend. Columbus is sailing off into myths and legends, and he's doing this in the context of Spain's reconquest. This is the Reconquista period of Spanish history. Now, we know, and we've discussed this a little bit on the channel before, that religion is often about control, and this is exactly what how religion is used in the early Spanish Empire. So it's religion that is giving Spain a reason for reconquista, for reconquest. It's giving Spain a reason to expel Muslims and Jews by the thousands from Spanish lands. It's religion that is allowing Spain to ignite a series of holy wars that will, by bits and bits, expand Spanish territory and allow the Spanish Empire and kingdom to consolidate its control. Spain, because of religion, is trying to extend God's empire across the earth. This is what's giving impetus for their early discoveries. And it's very important to understand this and to contextualize religion because, of course, there were believers, true believers, but this is not necessarily about the faith itself. This is more an expression of power. Religion is giving a massive lever of power to the Spanish crown at this point. And colonization to Spain was about more than just money and material wealth. It is really about power. And as we talk about religion, it's important to point out what Galeano tells us about this, which is that Spain, kind of absurdly, before each military action, the conquistadors were made to read what's known as a requerimiento, requirement, urging the indigenous people to turn Catholic and be saved. And of course, as Galeano says, the requerimiento was read in Spanish. And he gives the text in the book, by the way. Spanish is not a language that the local indigenous people spoke, but wow, what an incredible gesture. Either way, so religion is an important motivating factor for the conquest of Latin America, and it kind of underpins a lot of things that happen after this, and it will run through a bit of the rest of the book as well. But let's get into the good stuff, which is gold. And silver, of course. But gold is really what captures the imagination of these early Spanish conquistadors. And this chapter, of course, lust for gold, lust for silver, is going to give us a little bit of a story about how this happened. It's going to plot the rise and this mad scramble for the gold and silver of Latin America, of the New World. Galeano tells us the story, for example, of Hernán Cortés, who is coming into modern-day Mexico and toppling the Aztec Empire. He tells us as well about Francisco Pizarro, who comes into modern-day Peru and sacks the Temple of the Sun in the Incan Empire. He sketches out a little bit of this early history that a lot of people do already know, but this just gives it a little more impetus in this book. And he tells us fascinating things like the rise of the city of silver, Potosí, which still exists, of course, in modern-day Bolivia. And Potosí, he says, was as big as London, as Madrid, as Paris at the time. All of these people flocking to the city of silver to extract silver and send it back to Spain. And it was creating this really burgeoning city, all built on extraction. And of course, it fell because it was tied to extraction, but we'll get into that in a second. But Potosí became one of these fabulous new, unimaginably powerful cities in the region. And because of that, Potosí became incredibly wealthy, and anybody who really touched it, of course not the indigenous people, but anybody from Spain who touched these veins of silver running through Potosí became incredibly wealthy as well. Galeano says that the amount of gold and silver that was being exported from this area, roughly, between 1503 and 1660, exceeded total European reserves by 3 times. That is an incredible amount of precious metals just being sucked out of the continent and being put back into European markets, although crucially not into Spain. When he talks about Potosí, Galeano has this really fabulous line. He says, Potosian society, sick with ostentation and extravagance, left Bolivia with only a vague memory of its splendors, of the ruins of its churches and palaces, and of 8 million Indian corpses. Now, of course, as I say, that's going back to Spain, but not really. So Galeano says that Spain owned the cow, but others drank the milk, and that's a really apt metaphor for exactly what's happening. So let's dig into the second part of how to understand this chapter, how colonized gold built modern Europe. Now, as we try to piece apart what happened to Spain, we need to understand 2 basic ideas here to get at this idea. One is the natural resource curse, and the other is the idea of primitive capital accumulation. Now, with the natural resource curse, it's very easy to think about countries that are rich in certain natural resources. It's easy to think about them as being extremely lucky, right? Tons of gold, that will translate into a lot of money for your economy. It's actually the other way around. The thing about natural resources is that once they start flowing, they tend to put other parts of the economy in a total pause. So for example, if you're exporting tons of oil, the oil sector will grow and all of the stuff around the oil sector will boom, but the rest of your economy, the rest of the country will just languish at the same time. There's also normally a currency effect. This happens a lot in modern countries. When we talk about the natural resource curse, we often talk about something called Dutch disease, which is what happens when you're exporting a lot of one commodity, oil, for example, and to buy that commodity in your country, other countries, other people from other countries will have to buy your currency first and then buy the commodity, which raises the price of your currency relative to other currencies. What does that mean? Well, it means 2 things. First of all, if your currency is worth more than other currencies, that means that you, holding that currency, will be able to buy things comparatively more cheaply from other countries. So you start importing more. But also, anything that's not oil, people probably won't buy from you. So all of your other goods that are denominated in that high-priced currency, they start to fall behind because they're comparatively more expensive on other markets. Basically, that leaves you in a situation where you are importing everything and exporting one thing. The other thing about a natural resource curse, which Galeano really puts his finger on perfectly, is that it enables the creation of a fat and happy aristocracy that doesn't do terribly much. This is not an aristocracy that needs to make sort of what we would consider to be a classic social contract where you tax a population and offer them services because of that, right? This is supposed to be the two-way street of modern statecraft. Obviously, that's nonsense for several reasons, but that's typically how we understand nationhood. These aristocrats that are just producing one thing, one giant commodity, oil, for example, will be able to pay for services for their population without ever requiring anything back from them. So you are essentially, at this point, just paying off, bribing your population with oil money. We see that a lot in the Gulf monarchies, for example, now. And all of this, and I mean all of this, is exactly what happened to Spain. Spain is a classic example of the natural resource curse, but it's twisted, right? Because Spain isn't actually producing this natural resource. It's just pulling it from elsewhere and allowing it to flow through Spain. And Galeano describes the gold flowing into Spain as literally just coming kind of through it. It doesn't even stop really in the country. It may just stop in the port and then be shipped off somewhere else because that money is already being used elsewhere by wealthy aristocrats to buy foreign goods. Galeano has this tremendous line where he says the crown was mortgaged. It owed nearly all of the silver shipments before they arrived to German, Genoese, Flemish, and Spanish bankers. And he describes the situation of Spain as this colonizer as kind of this hapless, indebted entity that just is importing everything, fattening up its aristocrats, and producing basically nothing of value, but relying on these veins of Latin American capital to come through and continue paying off those debts. And eventually that system will collapse, as indeed it did. Now, the other part of that, of course, is that capital that's being shipped off from Spain is going elsewhere in Europe, and there it is being used productively because it's going into a manufacturing base that's producing things to sell to Spain. So it's actually building up and developing the rest of Europe, particularly Northern Europe, while, the extractive empires of Spain and Portugal, for example, are just they're becoming rich, but they're also languishing in terms of production. It's worth wondering a little bit about, was there anything that Spain could have done differently? Could they have invested it productively in local production? Yeah, maybe. And there are countries that will try to escape the natural resource curse through that means. Norway is a really good example of that. They have a sovereign wealth fund that's based on oil revenues, and they try to use that money as productively as possible, but it's kind of an open question of how much does that actually do in the case of Norway. Anyway, that's an open question, and it's kind of an academic, economic one, but it's still interesting to think about. Back to Galeano. And back to the idea now of primitive capital accumulation. Primitive capital accumulation is an idea from Adam Smith, one of the fathers of modern economics, as he's typically considered, the Scottish philosopher and economist. Now, this is something very interesting because it's at the heart of this question. You have capital and you have capitalists, but where did they come from? Where did they get that capital to become capitalists and to have enough capital together that they can start employing others and extracting value from labor and all of this stuff? This becomes a Marxist question as well, but we'll get to Marx. Now, Adam Smith's answer to this is this idea of primitive capital accumulation, that first capital accumulation, is just that some businessmen were smarter and luckier and amassed some capital, and then it snowballed from there. In Smith's account, it's just clever people making good decisions with capital. With Karl Marx, who comes much later, this is a significantly more evil and violent process. Karl Marx thinks that primitive capital accumulation happened at the point of the sword and gun. This is something that happens with violence, with war, and with conquest, and with extraction, especially extraction from the colonies, and Galeano agrees. Galeano says that Europe, and again, Spain's star is fading, so we're often just talking about Northern Europe here, but Europe is using this capital that's being extracted from Latin America to amass enough capital to bring about the conditions of primitive capital accumulation, and this capital is what they use to eventually kick off the Industrial Revolution. In a very real way, modern capitalism in this idea is brought to us by the colonial age, by this colonization that brought capital from around the world, centralized it into Europe, and then Europe used that to kick off an industrial revolution. In fact, several industrial revolutions. And of course, this is not just Latin America, this is Asia, this is Africa, this is Britain operating in India. A lot of this comes from everywhere around the world, and it's all coming back to Europe. But if that's how the colonies developed Europe, then how does Europe keep the colonies from developing? Well, let's get into Latin America here. This answer has three parts, basically, according to Galeano, and you could add other explanations. I'm going to stick to Galeano on this one because I'm quite convinced by his story, the story that he tells here. But let's get into it first of all, and then you can make your own decision. So, how did Europe keep Latin America underdeveloped? Well, there are three reasons here. First of all, violence. All of this happens with violence. Secondly, local elites, which are used to control and extract. And third, literally banning competition with the colonizer nation. Now, with the first one, with violence, Galeano gives us a ton of examples here. We talked a little bit in the introduction lecture about the Incan leader Tupac Amaru, who liberated Potosí and marches on Cusco. In this dramatic fashion, he's standing up to the Spanish Empire, and he gets crushed, tortured, and killed for his crimes. Galeano also mentions a couple uprisings in Mexico, very, very famous uprisings by people like Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos, who also stand up to the Spanish Empire and rise with the peasantry and are also crushed and become symbols later on, but are in their own time absolutely crushed by the power and violence of empire. And all of this happens with violence, right? Indigenous people throughout the continent, starting from the very first days of colonization, are used as slave labor. They are killed when it's expedient. They are expelled from their lands when something was found that was worth exploiting. All of this is happening with absolute impunity by the Spanish crown. You know, they're really, and you get this from a book like Open Veins, there is no word that can adequately describe what the early empires did in Latin America and indeed around the world. You can call it genocide, and of course it was a genocide, but genocide doesn't even cover it. This is something that goes beyond. Galeano says the statistics he cites are that the indigenous population of Latin America went from 70 million to 3.5 million after a century and a half of conquest. 70 to 3.5 is an extraordinary drop. Those statistics are debated, and there are very smart people who look into the historical evidence to find actual numbers, but it almost doesn't matter. This is a level of destruction where the destruction itself literally cannot even be described. We do not have adequate words or stories to share this idea. It's on a scale that we really cannot comprehend. So when we think about the violence of empire in Latin America, it's genuinely hard to get a handle on it. But there's of course another part of this, and that's the second part of his explanation for how Europe kept Latin America underdeveloped, and it is relying on local elites. Now, we're not really talking in this sense about picking local indigenous clients. Of course, Spain did that. Every empire did that. They would pick local indigenous people to serve both as oppressors and oppressed. They gave them a tiny bit of power in the context of empire and asked them to rule over their fellow indigenous people. That was a tactic, a divide and conquer tactic that really, really worked. But this is not really what Galeano is talking about in this part of the book. He's talking more about local white power or Spanish power from people who came from Spain to rule in Latin America. Now, in this case of local landowning elites, clients of the Spanish Empire, they were doing exactly what the aristocrats of Spain were doing, just at a smaller scale. So because this is a type of empire that is absolutely based on extraction, these land-owning elites were just extracting. And it sets up this distinction between what's happening in the Spanish and Portuguese empires and what's happening in the English and French empires. This is something that you'll hear a lot, which is just the type of settler colonialism which is being practiced by the English and French. It's just not as easy to access natural resources up there. It's not like you can rip up a mountain and pull out a ton of gold like you could in Latin America. The wealth of Latin America is, in Galeano's account, what dooms it. So you can set up an extractive empire, whereas in northern North America, you can put down settlers and have them farm and then expand and replace the local indigenous population. It's a lot more intensive and requires a lot more development. This is kind of Galeano's explanation for what happened with the continent, what happened with the uneven development of the continent, you could say. Now, that's one explanation, and we should be skeptical, extremely skeptical, actually, of giant explanations that claim to explain developments in one sense or another. It will always miss parts of the story, but it is nonetheless for sure a component. Either way, the new aristocracy set up in the new world was set up to extract, not to build anything, just to extract. And finally, to answer this question, we have the literal limitations that the empires would put on the development of the continent. And there are a couple examples. So because these empires, like Spain and Portugal, they want gold and silver and nothing else, they're not looking to compete with producers or manufacturers in the New World. They just want to keep the gold flowing. Because of that single-minded focus, everything else that isn't the production of silver and gold, in classic natural resource curse, just languishes. It just falls apart, especially agriculture. So in these incredibly rich and fertile parts of the Americas, you have extreme hunger in many places because, it would be easy to farm stuff there, but it's just not what these empires are interested in. They don't care that indigenous people are starving in their colonies. They just want to keep the gold and silver flowing. And as for nascent manufacturing and things that could add value to the natural resources that are coming out, that's also not happening at all either. There's a story about the Portuguese banning sugar refineries in Brazil in 1715. And they actually, in 1785, they also burn local looms and spinning mills. This is a concentrated effort by the empire to keep development just to the level of natural resource extraction, nothing else. Now, of course, those three main explanations are only part of the story, and you can think about things like trade rules and slavery and disease and everything. And of course, those are also parts of the story of how Europe kept Latin America underdeveloped. But these three, they do read to me as very, very persuasive and things to keep in the back of your mind, especially when later in the book, Galeano starts to talk about more modern forms of empire, which is probably the most fascinating bit of this incredible book that we have in front of us. But let's finish up with our analysis of this chapter by talking about the ways that empire justifies itself. It is important to understand that no empire understands itself as evil. There is really no, or at least very few empires who just say, yes, we are all about extraction and it's just pure evil, and yes, of course, we're here to kill people. Every empire is going to try to justify itself in one way or another, and looking back on what Spain and Portugal are trying to do in Latin America is very, very interesting. Looking at these historical examples, I think can be quite instructive. In Spain, for example, you have this idea that we talked about at the beginning, the requerimiento. They're officially giving native peoples the ability to convert to Christianity and spare themselves. Even if it's nonsense to the point of being almost comical, it's still kind of part of their national justification. So just like the British Empire, if you read anything about the British Empire is obsessed with this idea of civilizing the barbarians. They have this civilizing mission, and Spain is trying to do the same thing. They're trying to spread Christianity and defend Christendom, and it is out of their respect for the barbarians that they must then kill the barbarians because they are trying to spread God's word across the world, and this will save humanity. And they'll also try to pretend to be roughly humane in that endeavor. So Galeano, for example, talks about in 1601, Philip III of Spain banned forced labor in the mines, even as he kind of privately allowed it to continue. There was a recognition a little bit that there is a degree of humanity in the indigenous peoples that is worth defending. Of course, Galeano ties this to modern times when, it was still until very, very late an open question of whether or not you could consider indigenous people to be human. I mean, it's an insane thing, but it was a degree of tremendous debate in these empires at the time, and continuing, of course, until far too late. But suffice to say, there were plenty of laws on the books in Spain that protected the rights and abilities of indigenous people to mine for gold in the same way that the Spanish were mining for gold, to outlaw forced labor and slavery, all this stuff. There were justifications on the books. And all that did, because in practice nothing's changing, but all that did is allow Spain to kind of assuage its own conscience here. The practice of conquest and extraction wasn't changing at all, but Spain could look inward and say, we're still the good guys in all of this. Now, Galeano is going to get much more into this idea later on as we go through the book, but it's worth asking the question now, which is, how do we think of ourselves in our present moment in this light? And the answer, of course, is that we do the exact same thing now. So now our missions of extraction are framed as humanitarian responses. We don't go in to secure Iraqi oil, we go there to defend democracy and to build nations. This is the same thing the United States does now what Spain was doing back then. And this is not just the United States, and that was not just Spain. This is every single empire that has existed or will exist. They will always seek to justify their actions, and they will often couch it in this language of the civilizing mission. The civilizing mission never ended. It is still very much with us. Now, I know I said I would try to keep this video quite short. I'm conscious that I have not done that at all, but you know what? We will leave on this depressing note. Next week, we will get into the second chapter of this book, which is all about the great agricultural demons of Latin America and especially King Sugar. So we're going to be talking about sugar. We're going to be talking about cotton, oil, the slave trade, all of this. There is a lot packed into the next chapter that's coming up. I believe it's actually the longest chapter in the book. That's, of course, King Sugar and other agricultural monarchs. So I will see you for that next week. In the meantime, please do not forget to check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think about all of this on social media, and especially if you are tackling this book along with this series of videos that I'm doing. I want to hear what you think. I want to hear what you are most invested in, what you're most surprised about. Is there anything that is jumping out at you from this tremendous book, and has it changed your opinion or the way you look at the world in any way? This is all stuff that I want to hear. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.